Okay, today we're going to be talking about record keeping and how this plays into accident investigation as well as falling into workers' compensation. And so after the accidents happened, the employees had help. They've seen the doctor. You've got some results from the doctor. That's when your record keeping from OSHA falls into play. Before 1970, obviously, there was no way to actually monitor and try to figure out how many accidents and health problems there were with regard to companies. But now that they have some record keeping information, which means that you do have to submit it to the BLS, which we'll talk about here in just a second. But what now that happens is that you can actually go back and say statistically this is what's shown. And so you can see some numbers over here from BLS, which is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and you can actually press the link and go directly to that if you want to look at some statistics for any type of company. But I just chose one of some of the information out here, and this is directly off their site for 2010 though, but it was showing for 2009 because it does take some time for it to catch up to itself. So you can see that the total number of recordable cases in 2009 was over 3 million, and the cases days away from work was about 1 million, you can see there. And then the cases involving injury to the back were quite extensive, and we'll be talking about back safety and proper lifting and all of that soon. Quite a few falls you can see, but you can go in through here and actually get this information and go around in bls.gov if you want to get more. So who actually keeps OSHA logs? And this is pretty much everybody, but of course it does have exemptions on this. If you have 10 or less employees, then you don't have to. But then again, if you are requested by OSHA that you submit it, you probably do need to submit it. They do like a voluntary submit where they're requesting that you do that, and you don't have to. But if you don't, they typically frown upon that. Also, too, certain industries that have limited losses, some of those are partially exempt, and you need to kind of look in the OSHA regulations to see if your company is exempt or not. What we really need to be looking at is OSHA 300 and 300A logs, and 301 is only used if you don't have your own form, your incident investigation form, but typically companies don't use that. I'm going to show you all three of them so you can see what we're talking about though. Okay, so here you see the OSHA 300 log, and this is actually maintained by everyone. You can see that in the first column there's a case number, and this is sequentially 1 through whatever. If you go to another page, then you don't start renumbering, you just continue your numbering. Employee's name, go ahead and put that on here. No one's going to really see this. It's going to be kept in an area where not everyone will see, so you can go ahead and put the employee's name there. There is an exception on the employee's name though. If it is a privacy case, which they can consider something if it's hit a private part, or employee doesn't want to be listed on there for a specific reason, then you can put a privacy case on there. Their job title, what their date of injury was, and this is the actual date of the injury or the date of the onset of the illness, and this could be further back. So you could have maybe 5 entries in there, and let's say that the date is 5/22/12, and the next day, or maybe even today, someone comes up and said, I've been having this trouble and I was injured back in March, and this is what my injury is. And so at this point you would go ahead and put them in there on number 6 because you already had 5 injuries on here, and then you would list the date, not as today's date, but the date of the actual injury or illness. Where the event occurred, and you can see that these are really small lines, so try to be succinct as possible. This does not take replacement of your accident investigation on either E or F, but try to be just as simplistic as possible on this log. On F, you describe the injury, what the body, part of the body, and make sure you put like left hand or left finger, however you want to do that. And then the classification of the case, you need to check one of the boxes. Entering the days away that the person was away from work or on the job transfer and restriction. We'll talk about that later. And then you're going to check the last column to define what type of injury it is. Okay, the next form is your 301 form, and as I mentioned, you don't have to fill this out. This is not required, and if you already have your first aid form and you've got one for your company, most companies don't use this. It's very simplistic, but if you don't have one, you can use this, and this is also on the BLS or the OSHA website. You can obtain these forms. Okay, this is your 300A form, and this along with your 300 form are going to be the only required forms if you are required or your company is required to fill these out. Your 301 form, as I mentioned, is just something that's voluntary and you don't have to fill those out, but if asked which you have to fill out or that are required, it's going to be your 300 and your 300A. Your 300 is going to actually be filled out within 7 days of the accident, and your 300A form is going to be filled out once a year. And what you do at the end of the year, probably in January or so, you do need to go through and calculate and add up all of the columns that are in your 300, and that's where you're going to get your information for your 300A form. As you can see here, the total number of cases, it's going to be your total of your column G. When you look at the number of deaths, or if you look at the number of cases of days away from work, it's going to be your H. And then your I will be your job transfer restriction, and your J is going to be your number of recordable cases. And then down in your total number of days away from work is going to be your total of column K, and column L is going to be the total number of days of job transfer and restriction. And then in column M, you're going to be adding up all of your injuries, your skin disorders, etc., and making sure that you put that down. As you can see over on the right side, it states that your establishment name, your city, your street address, and everything else is going to be on there. You do need to have an industry description, which you can actually get off your SIC code or your NAICS code, your accounting department, or you may already have that information, but you just need to list one of those. You don't need to list both of them. And the one that you're actually listing is the one, excuse me, that is your most prevalent product that you're producing. So if you produce like 3 or 4 products, and they're different types, and you would put down the one that makes the most income for your company. The next thing you're going to do is put your employment information. It's the annual average number of employees that you have, and this does include temporary employees that you have employed there, and then your total hours worked by all employees in the previous year. And that information you'll probably get from accounting. You do have to make sure that this is signed, and this cannot be signed by just an average person or an accounting executive or something like that, or even a safety manager. You're typically going to have to go higher up and get this signed by someone of management. And so make sure that you're having that signed and that you've checked all the information on there. This 300A is posted, and as you can see, it has no names on it, but you do have to post this in several places throughout your facility or your company, and it has to be posted February 1 through April 30th. If OSHA comes in and they see that the form is not there, then you're probably going to get a fine and a record keeping citation on that. So when you start looking at what's going to be recordable and what's going to not be recordable, these are some steps that you can kind of go through. If the employee actually experienced an illness and injury, if it's work-related, it's a new case, and it meets the general or recording criteria or the specific case, then yes, it's going to be recorded. And we're going to go through each one of those specifically and separately. Okay, on this injury or illness, to kind of define between the two of those, an injury is going to be from a work-related accident or exposure, and it's from a single incident, whereas an illness is going to be some type of disorder or some type of illness that is caused by exposure over a longer period of time or a shorter period of time. It just kind of depends, but it's typically going to be something associated with employment as well. Your fatality reporting, something I do need to mention is that within 8 hours you do have to file a report with the local OSHA office. You do have to make sure you give them a call, and that number is definitely on the OSHA website. That may be something that you have in your accident investigation file too, of the numbers that need to be called and who's going to be calling. You should have definitely a designated person who knows a lot about this call-in versus just a regular employee. You also probably need to make sure that you have some type of PR team that's identified with a fatality. Most media is going to be out there fairly quickly, and so you want to limit any type of statements to any type of press or media. And then also, too, you make sure that you let the firefighters or the police know immediately that there has been a fatality. But definitely do remember that 8 hours because it's very important to remember. Okay, so there's just a lot of questions and that type of thing. So where do you keep the forms for this? As I said, this is going to be something that's not going to be posted. Your 300 form, your 300A obviously is going to, but you do want to make sure that it's not in the normal work area where people can get to it because you have some information on there with employee name and that type of thing. So you don't want to get that out into the public. Now, if you're not working in the place where they actually report to work, let's say like on a construction site or something like that, you don't want to keep it out in the field necessarily. It may be just that people report it back into an HR department, but typically it's where the employees are paid. Now, the critical dates on these is on the 300 log. Once again, it's going to be 7 days of the incident. You need to make sure that it's recorded. And your 300A, those need to be posted February 1st through April 30th. Your additional record keeping is going to be pretty extensive. When you start looking at any type of monitoring of exposures, and this can be like industrial hygiene settings, any type of exposure measurements with lead or hearing, anything like that, physicals that are required by your company, all of those are going to be kept by the employees' amount of time that they've worked plus 30 years. And so that's a little bit different than most people think about record keeping. When it comes to employee training, you're going to keep that 1 year past the last day that the employee was actually working. Honestly, on the employee training, I know I've mentioned this before, I'd probably keep that a little bit longer. It doesn't take up that much space if you're looking at that, or you can put it in their personnel file when you get done and just kind of highlight that. But I'd make sure that I kept some of that information a little bit longer than 1 year probably. Okay, so when you're looking at the OSHA record keeping, there are three criteria that we just talked about. The first one's going to be work related, and this is OSHA's language verbatim. It's in any event or exposure in the work environment either caused or contributed to the resulting condition or significantly aggravated a pre existing condition. And then you start looking at what a new case is, and we'll talk more about these later as well. But it's employee has no previous recorded injury of the same type, that same part of body, and if it has been recorded previously and the person is completely recovered, then it would be a new case, and you want to record it only once. When you start looking at the recording criteria, this actually meets general or specific recording criteria, and this would be death, any type of days away from work, or restricted work, or transfer, and we'll talk about that later. Medical treatment beyond first aid, and we'll talk about what first aid is and what first aid is not. Any type of loss of consciousness and when that happens, and then needle, stick, and sharps injury, would that be under the general and specific recording criteria? So is it work related? Is the and this is kind of just a little quiz for you guys. Is the employee swimming with his family at the pool when he slips and falls and breaks his arm? Would that be work related? No, it would not, because he's actually swimming with his family at the pool. Even though he's employed there, he was on obviously swimming with his family, and that was off work, and so that would not be work related. An employee is diagnosed with a mental illness. Typically, that's going to not be work related. It can probably be argued at times that some type of stress caused some type of mental illness, but 9 times out of 10, they're going to say no, that's not. An employee is working from home telecommuting, and the chair that they're sitting on collapses, injuring them. Well, if they're actually working and the chair they're sitting on while they're actually working collapses, and yes, that's considered work related. If they're just in their living room eating lunch, or they're at their other table, their dining room table, and that they're not actually doing work at that point in time, then no, that's not going to be work related. An employee is driving a company truck that's delivering gravel to a work site when injured. Yeah, he's actually doing something where he's delivering, you know, gravel, and so yeah, that would be one. An employee is eating a sandwich and chokes on a sandwich. Well, this gets back to, okay, you know, this sandwich was provided by the employee, and the employee chokes on a sandwich and it's on their lunch break, then typically that's not going to be work related. An employee gets food poisoning from pizza provided by the employer as a safety reward. Now, actually, this one, even though you would think, because I just said if a person brought in the sandwich, they choke on the sandwich, then it's not work related. This one, because it's actually provided by the employer, and the employer is the one who brought it in, and just as because not just because it's a safety reward, but for any type of meal like that, and they get food poisoning, then yeah, that would be work related. So here's some questions with regard to a new case. An employee fell and broke their arm. Well, if they did that at work, obviously, and this is the first time they broke their arm, then yeah, that would be definitely a new case. An employee had previously suffered from a back injury and has had no restrictions for the past 2 years. He tried to move a box of metal parts, is now unable to work and will require surgery. Okay, this person has had a back injury previously, and even though it's the same part of the body that's going to be, you know, having to have surgery on, person has had no restrictions for the past 2 years, so this would be a new case. An employee was diagnosed with occupational cancer last year. She's not previously had lost time due to this illness, but is now off work due to chemotherapy treatments that she's receiving. And this actually this gets into, okay, was this recorded previously? And it should have been. Because if they were diagnosed with occupational cancer last year, obviously that was work related, and you know, the way that the question is stated, that yes, that should have been recorded previously. Even though they haven't had any lost time due to this, they did probably max out at the 180 days on this, and so it has been previously recorded. The person's just kind of continuing that treatment because it's not something that went away and they didn't have any restrictions on it. It's just always been there, and so this one would probably not be a new case because you should have probably recorded it previously. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about days away, TR, IR, and LT rates. Your days away, when you're starting to look at that, is going to be your days away, restricted, or transfer. And when you're looking at this, there's a couple of things that I need to probably mention. If the employee comes back to work early, and let's say that the employer sent the person to the doctor said, okay, you need to go back to work in 2 weeks. Well, the employer said, you know, I think I'm okay, I want to go back to work in a week, because they're not receiving their full pay, or they're not receiving any pay actually if you're in the state of Kansas, because of the 7-day waiting period. And so what they do is they come back to work. Well, first, if I were a company representative, I would say, you know what, you need to send that person home, because regardless of whether you feel that that person is okay to work, or if they feel that it's okay to work, the doctor has specifically restricted them for 2 weeks, for 14 days. And so you need to either send them home or send them to the doctor, and if they get a new restriction that says that they're only 7 days and that they can go back to work, then at that point in time I'd allow them to come back to work. But regardless, you need to list it for the full 14 days. Also, too, within that 14 days, let's say the employer leaves and they don't come back, then you would go ahead and list the full 14 days on that. The next one's going to be a total recordable incident rate. And this is your total amount of your incidents, and then your lost time rate is how much time you've actually lost in this. And so let me look at this worksheet here and just kind of talk to you about this. Your total recordable cases is calculated by taking the total number of injuries and illnesses, and then multiplying that by 200,000, and then dividing that by the number of hours worked by all employees. Now that 200,000 figure is like an estimated amount of hours that a person's going to work, and it's just a figure that's out there. But this is going to get your total recordable case. So then what you can do if you want to get your DART rate, your days away, restricted, and transferred incident rate, and you probably need to kind of watch both of these. You take the number of entries in column H and column I and multiply that by 200,000, and then the number of hours worked by all employees, and then that would give you your DART rate. Okay, so what do those mean and why do I want to calculate those? Well, this kind of helps you out to see if you're within range, if you're way high compared to what other people in your industry are going to be. And also, too, your insurance company is going to be looking at these rates, and that's how they're going to put some of your workers' compensation insurance rates, and that's how those get higher or lowered, one or the other. So if you start looking at this, and I've just listed here plastics manufacturing, and the average employees in the thousands are 672.8. And the total recordable rates, and this is over all of the industry, is 6.3. And then the total is going to be 3.7. When you start looking at your days away cases, it's going to be 1.6, and your cases of transfer restriction are 2.1. So in this one column where it says total, those are total days away and transfers. And so if you can kind of look here how the figures are done, and I went ahead and put the number 10, let's say on the DART rate, those are 10 days away, and then you actually have 476,000 hours that are worked. You're multiplying that by 200,000, which is the figure, and then it's 4.2. The industry is actually 3.7, and so you're going to be high. And so you need to kind of work on those days away, work and transfers. Your lost time is going to be on here. Let's say that you only had 3 lost time cases. And once again, we're just using the figure of 476,000, multiplying that by 200,000, and you come up to a figure of 1.3. Well, the industry rate is 1.6, so you're actually under that, so you're doing fairly good. Your total recordables are going to be 18, and this is all the recordables that we've actually had on our OSHA log, our 300 log. And you can see that you divide that by your 476,000, multiply it by the 20,000 that we talked about earlier, and you come to a 7.56, and this is pretty high. And so you probably need to get those rates down too. So you can see how this does kind of fall into whether you're looked at or not, or whether your insurance company is going to be looking at you as well. Also too, if you have a really high number, OSHA sometimes will choose those high cases, number of cases, and come by and do an inspection. So those are always something to look at. Okay, so when an injury occurs, obviously you're going to be filling out the injury, and this is kind of on the other side. We talked about the accident investigation, and so you're going to be doing that as early as possible. But this is actually talking about reporting it to your workers' compensation company or the person who handles your insurance, your workers' compensation insurance. So you want to fill out this first injury report, and typically it's online. Sometimes it's something that you just have to fill out a one sheet of paper and fax it to them. But it's just going to be a very brief initial investigation so that it starts the ball rolling on their end. And then you need to make sure that you're reporting that to the carrier, your insurance administrator, within 48 hours so that they can do that. Typically they require 24 hours, but it just depends on your insurance carrier. And then you want to obviously then start doing your accident investigation, your root cause analysis, and get all that information together. And then make sure that you are keeping that all in one area with any of your job procedures, any witness statements, anything like that we talked about previously. And you want to start a return to work file, and we've talked about that. Getting the person back to work as soon as possible and trying to get them to back to work full duty definitely is something that you want to do. And keeping that constant communication between you and the employee during the return to work effort, or if they're at home, make sure that you're monitoring that as well. Okay, so when we start talking about how to record, and by this you probably could have up on your screen or have printed off, make sure that you print off the 300 log and the 300A logs, because we're going to be talking about that, especially the 300 log. And so if you have this in front of you, you can see the number of days away from work where it says column H. And what you're wanting to do is actually count the calendar days. You don't want to count the day that the injury actually happened. And so that's the days away from work. Now, once again, and I mentioned this earlier, that if an employee comes back to work early, you need to probably send them away. But you do need to count that full amount of time until you get something different from the doctor. And so if it says 14 days, then you count 14 days even if they came back to work early. And then once again, if the employee leaves, you count that full 14 days if that's what the doctor said. On your restricted work or job transfer, this is going to be column I, and this is going to be where the employees actually can't perform one or more of their duties due to some type of job restriction or some type of transfer when you're looking at it. And so the physician's going to be the one who normally says that you need to or recommends that the employee not do this, and so this is very important to do. You never do like partial shifts; you only do full shifts. And on this too, you don't do the day of the injury as well, and so you start counting the day after the injury occurs. The other thing on the transfer, and that if this is the permanent, if it's a permanent transfer is what I'm talking about, you can stop counting when the person goes into a new job and it's permanent, but you do have to make sure that you at least list one day of transfer. And so let's say that the employee is getting ready to transfer over to an office job from a job on the floor, and the day before they were getting ready to do this, or 2 days before they were getting ready to do this, they were injured, and so they can't work at that job anymore. So you're just going to go ahead and stick them into their office job that they were going to get 2 days from the date of the injury. So you do need to put at least one day on there, and then you can stop counting after that case, because it is going to be a permanent change and transfer for the employees. For all of these, and I kind of mentioned this earlier when we talked about the occupational cancer, with all of these, you can stop counting after 180 days, and you really need to be specific on this. All you have to do is enter 180 days. So if a person is out 186 days, it's 180. If it's 349 days, then it's still 180. It's going to be the same straight across the board. And if an employee leaves for a reason unrelated to the injury, and this is what's so specific, is it, let's say the person doesn't feel that they can do their job anymore because of the injury, you'd still have to count out as long as the doctor says that they would be off. But if they leave because they get a new job or something and that's unrelated to the injury, then you can stop counting. Also, too, if an employee leaves related to an injury and maybe you don't get the full amount of time that they would be off because of that injury, then you've got to estimate out, and typically you can use your physician's reports for that. Okay, so once again, the 3 criteria to make a case recordable is going to be work-related, a new case, or meets general or specific recording criteria, and we're going to go through each one of these. Okay, your death. Sorry, I guess we're not going to go through all 3 of these. We already talked about the work relatedness and the new case, and so we're just going to move right on to the general recording criteria. I'm sorry. Okay, so if you look at this, death obviously is pretty definite. The person's not going to be coming back to work, and then obviously you need to record that as a death. That also too, you don't record any days except for that it is a death, because they're not going to be returning. There's not going to be any days away or any restricted transfers. With regard to days away from work, you are just going to record that normally as the days away from work, and we've talked about what that means and some of the examples of that. A loss of consciousness, when you start looking at that, now this can be like, and this gets really specific on this too. If a person faints because they're voluntarily giving blood for the Red Cross, let's say you have a Blood Cross drive or something like that, and the person gives blood, then that's not considered a loss of consciousness. But if a person, let's say, is getting a vaccination for work, or the person is getting a blood test that's required by work and they faint, then that would be a loss of consciousness, and it's really a total loss of consciousness on that part. If a person falls and hits their head because of some type of seizure that's not work related, That kind of gets into a sticky area, and I'd probably give OSHA a call on that one to see how you're supposed to record that, since it was not work related, because that would probably not be recordable in my point of view. The next one's going to be diagnosis of a significant injury or illness. And when you start looking at significant injury or illnesses, this can be work-related cancer, any type of maybe chronic occupational disorders like asbestosis or silicosis, any type of obviously fractured bones, cracked bones, punctures, eardrums, anything like that. There's just tons and tons of those, because it's a kind of, if a doctor diagnoses something, then that's typically going to be a significant illness or injury. When you start looking at restricted work, and I know we've talked about that, it's just keeping the employee from doing one or more of his duties that he normally does. And it talks about routine duties, and when it defines routine duties, it's actually tasks done at least one time a week or more. And so that's where you could get that. Your job transfer, we've talked about part or full day. Obviously, it's just going to be transferring from one job to another. And your first aid is something specific, and we'll go through that. So if it is medical treatment beyond first aid, then yes, it's going to be recordable. So we'll talk about what first aid is too. Okay, so first aid, when we look at that, this is actually administered by a layperson, a person who's not, this is not their specific job to do first aid. It may be a part of their job, or it may be a assigned part of their job, but it's not something they do. It's just someone practicing first aid. It typically is a one-time short-term treatment, and it's done to keep the condition from worsening. And so making sure that you understand what first aid is very specific, so you can understand whether it's recordable or not. Okay, the next thing is, what is medical treatment? This is where we're going to go through it. Now, when you start looking at it, if there's treatment that's listed on the first aid list, then it is going to not be a medical treatment. If it's not listed, then it's probably going to be medical treatment. So the first thing we're going to talk about is over-the-counter prescription drugs and giving it prescription strength. Obviously, that is going to be medical treatment because it's prescription strength. Now, this is with whether an employee decides to actually fill the prescription or not. If they were prescribed something by the doctor, and the fact that they actually were prescribed it makes that a recordable, even if they don't use it or not. Medical treatment is not, when you look at it, diagnostic procedures, and this would fall into any type of x-rays, blood tests, eye drops to dilate pupils. If they actually go into the emergency room and they're just cleaning up the wound and they put a band-aid on it, then that's going to be first aid. It's not going to be medical treatment. Just because they were seen by a physician doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to be a medical treatment on that. Any type of casts, splints, or any type of ortho devices to like immobilize any type of body treatment, that's going to be medical treatment. Whereas looking at any back belts and rigid stays, that's going to be medical treatment, but there are some exceptions to that, and we'll talk about that in a second. So treatments, chiropractic and physical therapy, typically these are going to be diagnostic procedures or considered first aid if they're counseling, and they're not going to be recordable. But if they start doing some type of manipulation or they have a work restriction that's provided, then it's going to be recordable. Hot and cold treatments are normally considered first aid. They're not considered medical treatments, and typically those can be done by anyone and can be done by the person themselves, and so those are not medical treatment, just first aid. Treatments such as elastic bandage, back belts that are non-rigid, finger guards, like those rigid finger guards, those are going to be first aid because they're just temporary immobilization. Drilling a finger, toenail to relieve pressure, draining fluid from blister, those are going to be all first aid compared to medical treatments. And once again, as I mentioned previously, if you do have a cast or a splint or any type of ortho device, back belts with rigid stays to immobilize any body part, then that's going to be medical treatment. So understanding the difference between what those are, rigid or non-rigid, and then what type of
immobilization it is will determine whether it's first aid or medical. The next one is going to be administering oxygen. And if you're actually just doing this as a first aid treatment or a precautionary measure, then it's not going to be recordable. But if the employee was actually exposed to a hazardous substance and they have, you're taking them for some type of medical treatment, then it's probably going to be recordable. Burns, the size and the degree of the burns doesn't really determine the recordability. In general terms, your first degree burns and some minor second degree burns are not going to be recordable, mainly because you can treat those on your own. But more serious first degree burns, second degree burns, and all three degree burns are considered recordable. So it really has to do with the treatment and how you treat those burns, not necessarily the size and the degree. When you start getting into prescription drugs, this is where it gets a little sticky once again. If they give them like over-the-counter drugs that are given to them as a sample, then yes, that's going to be just as good as a written prescription because they do have those available. But over-the-counter drugs, when you start thinking about it, like aspirin ointments, cough syrups, nasal sprays, those are all going to be first aid. But if it this is where I say it gets a little sticky. Sometimes they'll do an over-the-counter medication. And it's going to be like a prescription strength, and it's going to be recordable. And then also too, if the physician wrote out this person needs to take Benadryl or this person needs to do something, and if they've written a prescription out, they've told the employee to get the over-counter, then it's going to be recordable versus a non-recordable. So then we start looking at doing accident cause analysis, and we've talked about the accident investigation, but let's talk a little bit more about how to analyze this. It's very important that you do this, obviously, and that people are trained in this as well to look at design changes. And when you look at those design changes, what do you need to change? And this is going to be your corrective action. Is it going to be a process? Is it going to be the product that's actually used or the product that's actually made? Or is it going to be your procedures that actually change? Some of the disadvantages with regard to this, looking back, is that it's after the accident. The employee's already been. Now, when you ask about committees, okay, what are the advantages and that type of thing? Obviously, your advantages are the people who are in the know. They're the ones who are going to be working out in the field a lot of times because it's made up of an interdisciplinary area. So you may have some people from management, you may have some people from non-management, worker on the floor, someone from the office, and so you do have kind of a plant-wide exposure. When you start getting people on committees, obviously, then they're the ones who are creating these solutions, and so a lot of times it is easier for other employees to accept the new ideas. Now, there are some disadvantages. Sometimes they'll come up with suggestions that can't be funded. Let's say that they say, well, we need to air condition the whole factory, and it's going to cost like, $500,000. And yeah, it's a really good suggestion, but it's something you can't do. So, what are some of the other things that can be done? And then also too, you do have some things on like spy parties, and when you talk about that, it's people who just want to be in there for the information, and they don't want to be in there for the goodness of the employee or trying to figure out what happened. They're just there to figure out, kind of be in the know of everything. There is congressional debate going on with committees and what the validity of those are. Honestly, you can't be there 24 hours, 7 days a week, and so committees are helpful and they can help you out in your job. And so it's something that I probably would suggest because it's just not you; it'd be other people suggesting these items as well. Okay, so we've talked about all of this, and what we're going to do is actually put it into practice. You do need to make sure that you can get online, and you can go to bls.gov or osha.gov and type in your OSHA logs, or you can use the logs that I've actually attached in the OSHA under module OSHA, and excuse me, over module record keeping, and go into the record keeping logs, and we're going to kind of go through these, and so you can fill these out, and then you'll return those to me. So as you can see on this, there's several or several actual accidents that have happened. These are all true to life. It's something that either I've personally seen or something that I've got out of a text, meaning the OSHA logs and things like that. And I want you to go through and actually fill out all of these so you can see how to fill out these reports. If there is some type of missing information, let's say on this first one, Beth Martin, we can see that that's her name, the date that she was actually injured. We can see the location, but it doesn't tell what her job title is. I would just put like tree trimmer or something like that. Make sure that you are calculating the days away that she would be, because she was off work for 30 days, and it ended up that she would be permanently disabled, and she left because of early retirement under a disability clause. And so you would go ahead and put out the full amount of time that would be determined. So some of this stuff you'll have to make up, and it's not going to be totally wrong. But you do need to determine, going through the criteria, if it's work related, if it's a new case, and it meets the general or specific criteria, then yes, it's going to be recordable and you need to put it down on the form. If you determine that it's not, then do not list it on the form, and those are going to be due in Canvas. Once again, give me an email if you have any questions, and good luck on the activity.